markup in another committee. So we'll convene the hearing, have opening statements. We're due to vote on the floor, so we will probably have to recess for floor votes, and then we'll come and reconvene as soon as the floor votes are taken. So the subcommittee will come to order, and the co-chairman will recognize himself for an opening statement. I'd like to thank my distinguished co-chair, Mr. McGovern, and the distinguished executive committee member, Mr. Ellison, for collaborating on this important hearing on the human rights climate in Egypt. Congressman Ellison first requested that we hold this hearing, noting that there had not been a congressional hearing focused exclusively on Egypt's human rights situation since the 2013 popular demonstrations that brought an end to the Morsi government. Nearly 5 years ago, this commission held such a hearing in January of 2011. We did not know at the time, nor could anyone have known, the dramatic events and the radical changes that took place just weeks afterward. The popular revolutions of the Arab Spring, with its start in Tunisia, quickly spread across North Africa and the Near East, forcing longtime president and American ally Hosni Mubarak from power. However, the revolution's messages of reform, democracy, and anti-corruption were quickly drowned out by competing movements. Egyptians, after a series of elections and constitutions, narrowly elected Mohamed Morsi in June of 2012. International human rights observers noted human rights abuses under President Morsi, including torture by security officials, a stifling of expression, and a climate of impunity for both security personnel and radical non-state actors. Consequently, a string of massive popular protests against the Morsi government led to the eventual removal of the president in July of 2013. Notably, it was then Defense Minister al-Sisi who issued the announcement transitioning power to an interim civilian president. However, the ensuing transition of power to eventually elected President al-Sisi has followed as much, if not more, criticism for its human rights record. Observers note several severe crackdowns on dissent, association, expression, and other civil liberties. Furthermore, the current government has been criticized for the enforcement of laws restricting the freedom of religion. Security forces have been accused of torture and other direct violations of human rights. In what is perhaps the most severe trend noted by observers, the current government has used a tenuous security situation as a pretext to oppress and stifle political opposition. As this situation unfolds in Cairo, Egypt faces another threat to its human rights climate, that of terrorist organizations and their constant campaign to deprive human beings of their lives, deprive them. The Sinai province of the Islamic State wages an insurgency in the northern Sinai against Egypt's military. Other fighters have returned from Syria and Iraq and hope to return Egypt to Islamic rule. Other terrorists have been radicalized internally by Islamist groups that have long operated within the country. Terrorist groups obviously threaten the human rights climate in Egypt, but also represent an existential threat to Egypt's government and its citizens. I believe this hearing will offer an opportunity for change in the current state of affairs in Egypt. The U.S. interest of promoting democracy, the rule of law, and respect for human rights does not conflict with our interest in combating terror and mutually providing for a robust security. To the contrary, they are very much in line, and I have been encouraged by some of the actions of the current government. President al-Sisi's historic visit to St. Mark's Cathedral and his calls for unity should not go unnoticed. Similarly, his reflection point on the need for a revolution in Islam is courageous. The new government's confrontation of corruption and promoting economic liberty is also essential to meeting Egypt's challenges. However, these actions do not atone for the list of restrictions on freedoms, destruction of liberties, and repressive policies that seem to be growing from within Cairo. So I look forward to the testimony from our panelists here today. Hope we can explore sound solutions for these substantial challenges. And with that, I yield to my distinguished Executive Committee member, Mr. Ellison, for his opening statement.
Allow me to thank the chairman of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission and ranking member. I also would like to thank Mr. Secretary Tom Malinowski for his appearance here today and his commitment to the hard work of diplomacy and human rights. I'd also like to thank Chairman George. We're grateful for your appearance today and work and the work that you do to protect religious freedom around the world. To our civil society panel, Mr. Hamid, Mr. Sultan, Ms. Whitson, and Mr. Collingert, you and the organizations you represent are in the trenches every day and day in, day out, fighting for human rights. We're lucky to have you here. We want to say thank you. And certainly not least, I'd like to thank the Egyptian Americans who have come from near and far, driving many miles to be here with us today. We certainly appreciate your focus and attention to this critical issue. Some might say that you have every reason to be focused on this, but the truth is there's a lot of citizens who have every reason to be focused on a problem and who still are not. And so your civic engagement and your commitment to civil and human rights deserves recognition, and I thank you. Let me make it very clear that the United States and Egypt have every reason to strengthen and deepen our relationship. The maintaining a positive relationship with Egypt is important to U.S. national security interests, national economic interests, for many reasons. Among these, Egypt is the largest Arab country in the world by population and has a powerful cultural influence on the world. The Suez Canal is an integral part to international trade and commerce. And of course, we have an important military relationship with Egypt that is long-standing. Egypt is also geopolitically very important to the whole world, including the United States. And yet our relationship with Egypt should be marked with candor and accountability. Even though we have a long-standing relationship and are connected for a number of reasons, it's still critical that the relationship be characterized by openness about critical issues affecting Egyptians and Americans, and among those is human rights. The U.S. and Egyptian relationship is critical. As I said, Egypt is the second largest recipient of U.S. foreign aid after Israel. Each year, Congress sends about $1.3 billion in military aid to Egypt. So when members of Congress ask questions about the human rights picture in Egypt, it really is not the United States minding someone else's business. This is our business, and we have every right to inquire into this issue because our constituents want us to, because U.S. taxpayer dollars are involved, and for a whole host of other reasons. It would be a dereliction of our duty as members of Congress if we ignored the growing evidence of human rights abuses in Egypt. I can assure you that I have come about asking for this hearing very reluctantly. It has been my very strong wish that the human rights picture in Egypt would correct all by itself. That has not happened. Each day, new evidence seems to come forward to give reason to believe that there are a number of violations, including indefinite detention, suppression of press freedom, trial without representation or minimal representation, and I think that we have a number of witnesses who will elaborate on these issues. It's also, I think, important to note that even though there has been an election in Egypt and the current head of state has assumed control, that whenever any elected leader takes office with 97% of the vote or more, there is reason to suspect that perhaps the quality of democracy could be not as high as it should be. So for this reason and many others, it's important to focus on human rights in Egypt today. And let me also note that that there is a connection between the denial of human rights and terrorism. No one should be mistaken about the fact that one of the ideological leaders of today's movement that is characterized by violence against innocents to achieve political goals, also known as terrorism, is an individual who was executed by a prior Egyptian regime and wrote extensively from prison. President Obama recently said, when human rights are denied and citizens have no opportunity to redress their grievances peacefully, it feeds terrorist propaganda that justifies violence. So to reduce terrorism and dry up recruitment, it is important that all governments observe the human rights of all so that people who would exploit the human rights grievances won't be able to do so. Finally, let me just say, Egypt is a signatory to International Covenant on Human Rights and Political Rights and has international obligations to uphold human rights of its citizens. As members of Congress, we have oversight obligations regarding how our taxpayer hard-earned dollars are spent, and we cannot sit in good conscience idly while our basic military aid is used to violate human rights. And today, with this hearing, we're calling attention to these issues. It's my hope today that we can generate meaningful solutions for both the administration and Congress so that this important relationship between the United States and Egypt can endure on a solid footing where human rights are respected. And I yield back.
Chair, thanks to gentlemen. We are voting on the floor. We still have 6 minutes and 15 seconds. So I'm going to recognize our first witness and ask you to confine your remarks to 5 minutes, and then we can run over and get the votes. There are 3 votes in this series, and then we'll be right back. But this hearing will provide firsthand accounts of the situation in Egypt, as well as recommendations from our experts, our panelists on the human rights issues in Egypt. And our first witness is Mr. Tom Malinowski, Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, U.S. Department of State. Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary, for coming. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, Congressman Ellison. Thank you for your leadership on these issues and for holding this hearing, which has obviously generated a great deal of interest. You have a very, very distinguished second panel as well. And I do want to start by actually saying a brief word about one of the folks who will be testifying, Mr. Sultan, who is an American citizen. As you know, many of us worked hard to try to get him out of prison in Egypt. We did so because he was an American citizen unjustly detained, and that was enough for us. But since he has come back, a number of us have gotten to know him quite well. He had a chance to come meet Secretary Kerry at the State Department, and I have to say to you, I've come to see him as a particularly decent and courageous American, somebody who endured extraordinary hardship and pain for the sake of his principles and who's come out of it with such a positive attitude of just wanting to help others. And I'm very glad that you guys gave him the opportunity to present his story today. The relationship between the United States and Egypt is very important for all the reasons that that both distinguished members mentioned. Egypt has long been a strong partner for peace and stability. The United States is committed to the security and the economic well-being of the Egyptian people. That has not changed through all the turmoil of the last few years. We also know that Egypt faces unprecedented challenges today, including the threat of terrorism, the insurgency in the Sinai, attacks on military and police. terrorist attacks on civilians in Cairo and other parts of the country. Many Egyptians have paid a huge price in this fight, and we're committed to helping them prevail, although our efforts with Egypt have undergone important changes that perhaps we can discuss. We are providing security and economic assistance. That said, we want to be very practical about this. As Secretary Kerry said during our recent strategic dialogue with Egypt, border security and law enforcement are a significant part of the equation, but the even larger imperative is to persuade and prevent young people from turning to terror in the first place. So, how do we do that? Any country facing the kind of threat that Egypt faces has to have the support of religious authorities and educators and citizens who can stand up to extremists in their communities, which means that governments have to work hand in hand with civil society. There has to be trust between the authorities and the public, which can only happen when security forces respect human rights. And you also have to disprove what I think has become the terrorists' main argument, which is that there are no viable, peaceful means to pursue justice in these societies. And that can only be done if those who are critical of official policies can voice dissent through a democratic political process. So we have stressed, as you have, that human rights, democratic governance are not ancillary to countering terrorism. They are absolutely central. So let me summarize some of the issues that we have stressed in our conversations with the Egyptian government. First, it's true that President Sisi has made some very positive symbolic gestures and statements regarding religious freedom and tolerance, and you mentioned some of those. But the overall trend in the last year has been negative. I would point to large-scale, irregular, arbitrary arrests, disappearances, deaths of activists, as well as new allegations of lethal use of force during police raids, which could amount to extrajudicial killings. I'd point to a series of executive initiatives, laws, judicial actions that have severely restricted freedom of expression and the press, freedom of association, assembly, due process, including new counterterrorism legislation. I'd point to mass trials and the use of military courts to try civilians. Hundreds of people, as you know, have received death sentences in trials without any ability to present individual defenses. Now, we have pressed a number of these cases over the last several months. We welcome President Sisi's recent decision to release the Al Jazeera journalists, nearly 100 other activists, but many thousands of Egyptians remain in detention because they engaged in peaceful expression or took part in a demonstration or belonged to a political group, including many of the same young secular democracy activists who assembled in Tahrir Square in 2011. And there is reason to fear that amidst very harsh prison conditions, with thousands of political activists, political party members, protesters, all intermixed with common criminals and violent extremists in prison, the seeds of radicalization will be sown. This has happened before in Egypt's history, and the danger is especially great now because I think this situation reinforces that argument that Daesh, that ISIL makes to young people who place their faith in the democratic process in the Middle East, that the argument that peaceful methods are doomed, that those who rely on them will end up in prison, whereas those who go to Syria or Iraq or the Sinai to fight and kill will be strong and will be victorious. This is why Secretary Kerry has called on Egypt to move rapidly through its judicial system to address this problem of mass incarceration so that, as he said, young people are not pushed into greater radicalization as a consequence of the fight against it. So to conclude, we have an interest in helping Egypt counter these terrible security threats, and we're doing so. But we will continue to make clear that the best way to win in Egypt and in every country in the region threatened by terrorism and extremism is to build institutions legitimate and inclusive enough to unite everybody, whether they're conservative or liberal or secular or Islamist, who pursues their goals peacefully. That is our interest. That's what we're trying to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. As I said, we're voting on the floor. There is no time left, so we will have to recess to go vote, and we'll be right back to ask questions if you'll bear with us.
Of course.
So,
thank you.
thank you very much, and the subcommittee or the committee stands in recess until after the votes. All right, the time for recess having expired, we'll reconvene the committee. Thank you for your patience. I don't think we'll have any more interruptions this afternoon. So I'll begin the questioning and recognize myself for that purpose. Mr. Secretary, the State Department noted in its human rights report the, quote, unlawful deprivation of life, end quote, caused by terrorists and their attacks on the public. Can you please elaborate on the threats posed to human rights by non-state actors in Egypt?
I think you summed it up when you talked about deprivation of life, which is another way of saying killing civilians. And we have seen in Egypt, and of course not just in Egypt, horrific attacks on civilians by terrorist groups, chiefly now Daesh or ISIL, which is a primary threat to the security of our allies and a primary threat to the security of the United States as a result.
Now, the State Department's 2013 report, the last of which to have reported on Morsi's administration of the Egyptian government, documented that the Morsi government took actions to stifle freedom of expression, including demonstrating and religious freedom. Did the actions of the Morsi government make it easier or set a precedent for the crackdown being committed by al-Sisi's government?
I would say that there certainly were violations of human rights under the Morsi administration. We reported on it at times. The State Department publicly condemned those actions. But human rights violations by one government, by one administration, do not justify or provide a pretext for greater violations committed by anybody else. The victims in both cases are ordinary citizens who are trying to advance a better future for their country by peaceful means, and our interest remains the same regardless of who is in office in Egypt. Our interest lies in promoting respect for human rights and democratic governance because it's the right thing to do and because it is, for all the reasons that I think a number of us, including yourself, mentioned, absolutely essential to meeting our national security objectives.
Today, hardline Islamist groups continue to plague Egypt and the Coptic Christian community. Just last week, one watchdog group reported on the kidnapping for ransom of a 5-year-old Coptic boy from a village in Upper Egypt. Police initially refused to investigate, and the parents were forced to pay a hefty ransom for the safe return of their son. In 2014, ICC documented 97 such kidnappings, many, if not all, of which are carried out by armed gangs believed to have ties to the Muslim Brotherhood or other Islamic factions. Coptic leaders feel that President al-Sisi, though sincerely concerned about the abuses against the Coptic community, has been unable to reform the institutional anti-Christian biases found in countless police stations and courtrooms across the country that developed under the Mubarak regime and were hardened under former President Morsi. And this bias, coupled with a lack of equipment and training, makes local security forces highly unwilling to respond to these kidnappings and other abuses. Observers have noted that police and security services behaviors have not changed significantly since the change in government. A couple of questions. One, how systemic is abuse by the security apparatus in Egypt? Is this an entrenched problem that predates President al-Sisi?
Let me take the general question and then also address the issue with respect to the Coptic Christians. abuses by security forces, by police, have been a problem in Egypt for some time. In fact, this is one reason why so many young Egyptians in 2011 tried to change the system through the demonstrations in Tahrir Square. And at times things have gotten better, at times things have gotten worse, and we are going through, I think, a particularly difficult and dark period right now, because what's needed is a very, very clear message from those at the top that abuse of any kind by security forces against civilians, against prisoners, against those who are arrested, will not be tolerated. Now, with respect to the situation with the Coptic Christian community, which is something that we have followed very, very closely over the years, we have seen some progress in terms of particularly symbolic gestures that the Sisi administration has taken. Some actions, like the Army's willingness to rebuild at its own expense some of the churches that were burned down in 2013, the president's decision to attend a Christmas Eve Mass at a Coptic Orthodox cathedral, which was, again, a very good symbolic step. At the same time, as you suggested, there has not been a perceptible reduction in various forms of discrimination that Christians face in their daily lives. One example of this is that government and security officials in various parts of Egypt continue to oversee what they refer to as reconciliation sessions, in which perpetrators of sectarian violence against Christians and others are not held accountable for their crimes, and the victims have to relinquish their right to seek justice in the courts under the rule of law, and also a number of other problems. I think one thing that we would hope to see when this newly elected Congress in Egypt is seated, that it will, as mandated in the Egyptian constitution, pass a law regulating the construction of churches. Again, this is something that has been promised, delayed, something that can happen that would be a very positive gesture.
How can the United States encourage the Egyptian government to counter these violent assaults by hardline groups while simultaneously encouraging due process, the rule of law, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, protection of the fundamental human rights
I think
in Egypt?
the fundamental message, and it's what I tried to stress in my opening statement, is that the force of the security apparatus of the Egyptian state needs to be directed at those who are in fact doing violence to the Egyptian people, whether they are doing it against Christians or other minorities or other citizens of Egypt. Those who are doing violence, those who are inciting violence, those are the people who ought to be going to prison. And the problem is that that what we have seen is that a significant part of that legal force of the state has instead been misdirected against people who have merely been expressing criticism of the status quo peacefully through demonstrations, through Facebook posts, and so forth. And that's not only an injustice, but it takes the focus away from those who are actually doing violence.
Yeah. I remember, visiting with President Mubarak numerous times, there and here. And every time I saw him, I would raise the issue of El-Kush. Never any prosecution. It got toward the end, he'd go like this. He knew what I was going to raise. But, justice needs to be done. Two quick questions here. When assessing Egyptian government human rights record, how does the willingness and actions of the El-Sisi government in combating extremists factor in?
There is a very strong stated willingness to combat extremists, and we obviously share that desire, and our every step that we have taken in our policy towards Egypt in the last year, the last 2 years, has been designed to help to enable the Egyptian government to conduct that fight more effectively and in a more discriminating way. But the concerns that all of us have expressed today are very much linked to that imperative, because you not only have to go after the people, what we want them to do is to go after the right people and to stop going after the wrong people, and not to conflate violent extremism with the peaceful dissent that every leader in a democratic society faces and must tolerate.
Okay, and finally, do we have to rely on al-Sisi's actions as far as punishing human rights abusers alone? If Congress passed the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act, couldn't the U.S. sanction and punish gross human rights violators on our own?
We have, that's a whole separate discussion, of course. We do have authorities already that enable us to, for example, deny visas to people who engage in human rights abuses. We have provisions in the law that we implement with respect to Egypt, the Leahy Law, to deny assistance to those parts of the security apparatus that are committing human rights abuses. We have worked with members in both the House and the Senate to try to shape this legislation in a way that strengthens our authority to act where it's appropriate, but that doesn't tie us to a global policy in which we have to impose economic sanctions on literally every single person in the world who may be connected to a human rights abuse, which would be extraordinarily cumbersome. So that's where we are on that legislation.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Again, thank you for your patience, and now recognizes gentleman Mr. Ellison for his questions.
Thank you again, Mr. Malinowski. Could you detail, if you would, some of the violations that you've been able to track in Egypt in the current scene? I mean, how many people are experiencing prevented detention? How many people have been detained without trial? How many media outlets have been shut down? Sort of, if you don't mind, just giving sort of the picture.
Yeah, I'm going to be cautious about numbers.
Okay.
Because one hears
Different numbers.
different numbers, and you know, I cannot tell you exactly how many people are imprisoned in Egypt for those reasons.
Okay.
But we certainly have reason to believe that it's in the thousands, and hence the emphasis in my statement on the problem of mass incarceration of people who were not engaged in any sort of violent activities. So it is a very, very large problem. We don't need to know the exact number to understand the potential consequences of that practice, not just for human rights, but for our long-term security interests.
Right. And what about the press? And what about like the right to just peacefully protest? How would you describe the scenario there?
Well, there are a number of journalists still imprisoned. We very much welcomed the release of the Al Jazeera journalists, of course, but there are a number of others. And here I've seen numbers from, I think, the Committee for the Protection of Journalists of roughly 18 journalists still imprisoned. With respect to demonstrations, as you know, there's a very restrictive demonstrations law that makes it virtually impossible for people who want to express criticism of the current administration to go out and peacefully protest, and a very large proportion of those who are in prison, either convicted or awaiting trial, are there because of violations of this protest law.
Are there any international conventions which Egypt is a signatory to which binds them not to engage in these practices?
I have to admit I don't have off the top of my head a full list of conventions that they are party to.
But just a few that you may know?
If they are a party to the ICCPR, it would certainly be in violation of many provisions of that, but I acknowledge I'm not certain that they are. We can check on that,
Okay.
or you can ask some of the
Yeah, maybe our
next
witnesses.
panelist. And of course, there is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which we feel expresses principles that all nations are bound to follow. There's the Convention Against Torture,
Right.
which speaks to a very, very significant and important problem.
How would you just so the U.S. State Department has raised these concerns with the Egyptian government. What kind of cooperation have you seen?
I think it will not surprise you to hear me say that this has been a difficult set of conversations over the last couple of years. We have raised a number of cases of concern. In some cases, the Egyptian government has acted. Of course, one result of that is Mr. Sultan, who you'll be hearing from later. There was the decision by President Sisi, which we very strongly welcomed recently, to release the Al Jazeera journalists and 100 other activists, including some very prominent people. But overall, the situation is as I described. It is not a heartening one.
The Leahy Law. This is a piece of legislation that says that the U.S. State Department can limit or circumscribe financial aid in the form of training, equipment, other sorts of assistance to foreign military security forces if the U.S. government has credible information that these units have committed violation of human rights. Of course, I don't want to bind you here today. This is a complicated issue to resolve. But is the Leahy Law something that is a potential tool to try to get the Egyptian government to come into compliance with international conventions, which it has signed and is signatory to?
You can bind me. You have binded me.
Okay, well, I do
By
then.
passing the Leahy Law, it does
Right.
bind us. It is the law.
Thank you.
It
Yeah.
doesn't merely enable us, it requires us to suspend assistance
Right.
to any unit of a foreign security force, including in Egypt, if, as you suggested, we have credible evidence that it has engaged in gross violations of human rights. I am the person in the State Department who is responsible for implementing the law, and I can tell you that in the case of Egypt, we are implementing it, and it has had a significant impact on our ability to provide assistance to some parts of the security apparatus in Egypt, particularly the police and the Interior Ministry.
One of the things that seems to be at work here is that when we either withhold foreign assistance or threaten to based on human rights violations, that some of the countries that are in the neighboring in the neighborhood of Egypt simply supplement that. What about getting some regional cooperation from the Gulf, from our friends at Saudi Arabia, and trying to help the Egyptian people have a higher quality of human rights? Is this something that is a potential? Is this something that is being done? Could you share what you know about it?
We talk about these issues with all our partners in the region. Of course, we also talk to them about some of their own domestic issues. So
Right.
this is a difficult region and a very difficult and complicated time. And as you know, Egypt has heard from a number of countries on these issues, in some cases encouraging it to move in one direction, and in some cases encouraging it to move in precisely the opposite direction. Knowing that, we do engage our Gulf partners and others in conversations about what is happening in Egypt, and we say to them what I have said to you. I think, stepping back a bit, our experience shows that while it is often very difficult and frustrating to make progress on human rights issues in countries with the kinds of problems that Egypt has, with patience and persistence, I think we can make progress. I can think of many, many cases where in the moment when we were making this kind of effort, it felt as if we were not making any progress. And then in the fullness of time, it becomes clear that that change can and does happen, and often is affected by voices from the United States and the international community.
I have one last question. Can the Egyptian government or any government, speaking broadly here, legitimately claim that their security interests against real threats like Daesh justify clamping down on human rights for people who are civilians who are engaged in normal, free expression?
In fairness, I think every country that has been attacked by terrorists, including our country, has at times felt the temptation to limit freedoms, to take shortcuts in the rule of law. Established democracies face that temptation. But experience has shown us, including our own experience, that this is not necessary and, in fact, nearly always a mistake, that it actually strengthens the propaganda, the arguments that terrorist groups make, that it weakens the institutions that protect us, and it makes it harder to unite all of the people in any given society against what should be seen as a common threat to all of them.
Thank you, Mr. Malinowski.
Thank you.
I yield back.
Chair, thanks to gentlemen. Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary, for your testimony, for answering our questions. We may have follow-up questions. I'll send them to you in writing.
Of course.
Please respond. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Chair excuses the gentleman and now calls for second panel Dr. Robert P. George, Chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. And as always, your written statement will be made a part of the record, but we'd ask that you summarize your statement. And Chair now recognize Dr. George. And Dr. George, I'm told that around the corner in the markup, I'm needed. It's a very close vote. I'll be right back. I've got one vote, and I'll leave it in your hands. I'll be right back.
You bet.
Thank you, Mr. Pitts. As you're leaving, let me say just how honored I am, again, to be testifying before a commission named for the great Tom Lantos. He was a magnificent champion of international religious freedom. I have the great pleasure of working on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom with his daughter, Katrina Lantos Sweat, herself a great champion of international religious freedom and other fundamental human rights. In fact, Dr. Lantos Sweat and I have been going back and forth as chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and working with her is a very great pleasure. And Mr. Ellison, I want to thank you, and I want to thank Chairman Pitts, and I want to thank Chairman McGovern for the work of the Tom Lantos Commission and for the work that each of you, together with so many of your colleagues, has done to advance the cause of international religious freedom for people around the world. Journalists tell us that we live in an age of hyper-partisanship. Historians tell us maybe it's not so different from past ages in the United States. But it's wonderful to see that as many disagreements as people have, legitimate disagreements across a range of issues of domestic policy and in some areas of foreign policy, differences between the parties and so forth, still people come together across party lines, across the religious divides and so forth in America to fight for religious freedom for everyone around the world. Republicans and Democrats, Catholics, Protestants, Mormons, Jews, Muslims, Baha'is, Buddhists, Hindus. In America, we unite in support of the right of anyone, anywhere in the world to express their religious beliefs, to worship God as they see fit, to believe or not believe as they see fit, to change their religion if their conviction changes, to enter into the public square and bring their religiously informed beliefs about justice and the common good and human rights to bear in vying for the allegiance of their fellow citizens. That's a fundamental right that we recognize in America. It's in our very founding principles, in our DNA, as the great Frank Wolf sometimes says. It's in our DNA, and yet we understand it not just as a local right that we Americans should enjoy, but as a universal right that we, to the extent that we can, in the formation and execution of our foreign policy, should do our best to advance. So thank you very much for this opportunity to be before the Commission. And of course, I have written testimony, as you know, that I'll submit. While I need to focus today, of course, and will focus on the state of religious freedom or belief in Egypt and highlight some of our Commission, the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom's recommendations for U.S. foreign policy, I'd be remiss if I didn't note, as Mr. Malinowski did, that the Egyptian government's efforts to combat extremism and terrorism have dramatically chilled other fundamental human rights and civil society activities, with severe limits placed on dissent and criticism of the government. That has to be acknowledged as part of the background situation that we need to bear in mind as we're looking more specifically at the religious freedom issue, which is, of course, what USCIRF exists to address. Now, these limits have resulted in a poor human rights situation overall, with sympathizers and members of the Muslim Brotherhood, journalists, and opposition figures harassed, jailed, given harsh prison terms, including death sentences for Brotherhood members and other Islamists, sometimes on legitimate grounds, but also on unfounded security charges. Egypt is not alone in that, but it's part of the reality. In contrast, I can best characterize the status of freedom of religion or belief as one step forward and at least one step, maybe two steps back, and that's not good. While the al-Sisi government has clamped down on virtually all forms of dissent, President al-Sisi has made a number of positive gestures and statements urging reforms in religious tolerance. Again, Mr. Malinowski brought that to light. And his government has undertaken some initiatives to improve religious freedom, and of course we applaud those. We need to recognize them. We want an accurate picture of what's going on there. There's a lot on the negative side. There's some on the positive side. For example, just this year, the Ministry of Education started a process to remove passages from primary school textbooks deemed to promote incitement and extremism. And last month, as President al-Sisi decreed earlier this year, Egyptian authorities started to build a new church to honor the Copts killed by the Islamic State forces in Libya in February. We need to acknowledge these things. These are positive. It's part of the picture. Perhaps the most encouraging trend over the past 2 years has been the notable decrease in the number and scale of targeted sectarian attacks following extremists' violent assault on dozens of Christian churches and properties in August of 2013. Now, this decrease has been partly due to a greater security presence. We have been demanding that of the Egyptian government, and we're glad to see some steps in the right direction there. Furthermore, some changes, including in the January 2014 Constitution, could bode well for religious freedom, but it depends on how they're implemented. Article 235, again, we were discussing this, you were discussing it with Mr. Malinowski a few minutes ago, requires the incoming Parliament to pass a law governing the building and renovating of churches, thereby potentially lifting the long-standing government approval, requirement of government approval of both. The new Constitution also mandates the establishment of an anti-discrimination body tasked with eliminating bias, including discrimination based on religion or belief. At the same time, most existing laws and policies restricting religious freedom remain in place, firmly in place. That too is reality. And new government campaigns bode ill for Egyptian religious minorities and non-believers. Now, here are some examples of concern. Number one, conditions for Copts remain precarious, with sporadic attacks continuing, particularly in Upper Egypt, and most perpetrators of recent attacks having been neither convicted nor even tried, thereby perpetuating an atmosphere of impunity. And impunity is a real problem here, very serious problem. And we need to bring pressure on the Egyptian government to do something about that problem. Now, here at the same time, I want to take this opportunity to say that we should also be aware and grateful for those Egyptian Muslims who have, at risk to themselves on occasion, stepped forward to protect Coptic and other Christian churches and institutions. Too often this is ignored in the media. The bad stuff gets reported, and the good stuff just gets lost somehow. But the good stuff has to be held up as well so that people can see the complexity of the picture and give credit where credit is due, including to brave Muslims who are willing to stand up for the rights of their fellow citizens of different beliefs. The government has increased its control, secondly, over all Muslim religious institutions, including mosques and religious endowments, justifying this increase as needed to counter extremism and terrorism. Well, yes, some steps obviously need to be taken. We've been demanding them to counter extremism and terrorism and to do something about the problem of impunity. But we worry when governments go too far, as the Egyptian government in some cases has. And we also worry about pretexts, where the government cracks down for politically motivated reasons under the pretext of providing security to minority citizens. Again, Egypt is not unique in this, but it's part of the problem to be recognized. Third, small communities of Baha'i, people of the Baha'i faith, and Jehovah's Witnesses remain banned by presidential decrees that go all the way back to 1960. Now, obviously, this is simply incompatible with the internationally recognized rights of religious freedom, which Egypt itself formally, of course, recognizes. But it is an outrage when peaceful groups, religious groups such as the Baha'is, people of the Baha'i faith, people of the Jehovah's Witnesses tradition are actually banned. Fourth, Egyptian authorities have not combated anti-Semitism in the state-controlled and semi-official media. We here in the United States don't like state-controlled media of any kind. But if you're going to have state-controlled or semi-official media, then the state has some responsibility when it comes to grotesque, blatant, flagrant anti-Semitism or other forms of hatred being disseminated through state or semi-official media. Fifth, Egyptian courts continue to prosecute, convict, and imprison Egyptians for blasphemy, with cases dramatically increasing. This is bad news, increasing since 2011, with more than 15 new cases this year alone. Now, most of these charges have been leveled against Muslims. Most of those sentenced to prison, however, have been Christians, Shia Muslims, that is the minority Muslims in Egypt, and atheists. But regardless of who's being victimized by these laws, they really need to go. I mean, throughout many parts of the world, these blasphemy laws are used by regimes as a pretext for oppressing religious minorities, creating prisoners of conscience, and it really is simply unacceptable under the most basic international human rights standards. Finally, the Ministry of Religious Endowments launched a new campaign in April to combat what it perceives as threatening topics in mosques, but including atheism, the Baha'i faith, and Shia Islam, again, the minority religions. And we're obviously concerned about that, and the Congress should be. So based on these and other concerns, USCIRF recommended in April 2015 that Egypt be designated a country of particular concern, or CPC, under the International Religious Freedom Act. And this is a recommendation that our commission has been making since 2011. It has not been accepted by the State Department, but it's a recommendation that has been consistent since 2011. Our commission will, I assure you, continue to monitor the situation to determine if a change in our 2016 recommendations is warranted. As of now, we do not believe that a change is warranted, so we continue to urge CPC status for Egypt. And CPC status is simply the status statutorily required to be given where religious freedom abuses by a regime are systematic, ongoing, and egregious. Our commission also recommends that the U.S. government press the Egyptian government to do several things. repealed decrees banning religious minority faiths like the Baha'is and the Jehovah's Witnesses, remove religion from official identity documents. That really needs to be done. And pass a law for the construction and repair of places of worship once a new parliament is formed. Revise Article 98F of the Penal Code, which criminalizes blasphemy. And then prosecute perpetrators of sectarian violence, the people who carry out violence with impunity, through the judicial system, including past cases, such as the 2011 Maspero massacre, where justice has not been served. USCIRF also urges our government, the United States government, to do some things. In particular, emphasize in its annual reporting to Congress on human rights and religious freedom the Egyptian government's progress on the protection of religious minorities, prosecution of perpetrators of sectarian violence, and the ability of Egyptian non-governmental organizations to receive outside funding from sources including the U.S. Government. Let me conclude by stating that Egypt continues to experience both some progress but also setbacks during its transition, the success of which hinges on full respect for the rule of law and compliance with international human rights standards, including, of course, those for freedom of religion or belief. For the sake of stability and security, as well as human rights, the United States government should urge Egypt to choose the pathway to democracy and freedom for all Egyptians, those of all faiths and of none. Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I'd be happy to take your questions.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen, for your opening statement. I'll begin the questioning and recognize myself for that purpose. Since 2011, as you mentioned, USCIRF has recommended to the State Department that Egypt should be designated a country of particular concern, CPC, for engaging in or tolerating ongoing systematic and egregious violations of religious freedom, yet the State Department has never placed Egypt on that list. The question is, why do you think that is?
Well, of course, we continue, as I said, to urge the State Department to make the CPC designation. As I mentioned, we believe the designation is statutorily required where there is systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations of religious freedom. There, of course, is in the legislation the possibility of a waiver, but we think the designation does need to be made. And where waivers are granted, I would stress, speaking now in my own capacity, that they should not be of unlimited terms and unconditional. But to get to the heart of your question, the State Department really should be using this same standard. The standard isn't one thing for USCIRF and something else for the State Department. Now, that doesn't mean that the State Department has to agree with us every time on whether the standard has been met. But we think it's pretty clear in the case of Egypt, which is why we've been so consistently making this recommendation, that it has been met. We believe that the Department considers a wider range of issues that are part of the U.S. bilateral relationship with Egypt, as is the case, frankly, with other countries like Pakistan, another country that we have been urging for many years a CPC designation. In fact, in the case of Pakistan, we believe that's the #1 country on the offenders list that's currently not a CPC that should be made a CPC. But there are obviously a range of considerations that need to be taken into account when you're constructing and executing U.S. foreign policy, and that's not our job at USCIRF. Our job is to make recommendations specifically on the religious freedom front. But the standard is the same for us as for the State Department, and we really do strongly believe it has been met. So we're going to continue urging the State Department to make the designation, at least until the actual practice of the government or a government in Egypt matches some of the tone and rhetoric that we do have from the current government, but where the rhetoric is not backed up by the actions.
In your testimony, you have stated that the overall human rights situation has deteriorated since President al-Sisi came to power, yet you have cited some contrasting improvements for religious freedom during the same period. Do you believe these are cosmetic improvements, or is Egypt making genuine progress on religious freedom?
It's making some progress. What I pointed to are real steps forward. What worries me are the steps back and the failure to take the steps forward that are needed really across the board here. Since he assumed his office in 2014, President al-Sisi has made several really very noteworthy public statements and gestures. Gestures are important. I'm not trying to play them down. Gestures do matter, but we need more than gestures. But the gestures are important, and they're important as a way of encouraging in civil society tolerance and moderation. So there's been a shift in tone from his various predecessors. He's delivered some speeches, good speeches, urging reform of religious discourse of the sort that is problematic because it stirs up animosity and even sometimes, of course, incitement of violence against Copts or Baha'is or Shia Muslims or Sunni Muslims who don't go along with a more radical view of things. So that's good. That's good that President al-Sisi is doing that. He was also the first head of state, as you know, to attend a Coptic Christmas Eve Mass. I think Mr. Malinowski pointed this out, and he offered condolences in person to the Coptic Pope Tawadros, after the murder by the Islamic State in the Levant of 20 Copts and 1 Ghanaian in Libya. Just last month, as decreed by President al-Sisi earlier this year, Egyptian authorities, started building a new church to honor these Copts, and that's good. That kind of gesture makes a difference. That's why I say I don't want to make light of gestures or just say they're mere gestures. He's also urged reform of religious curricula and textbooks to get some of the extremism out of them, and that too matters. When you're bringing up the next generation, you know, how you bring them up, what's in those textbooks makes a difference. Our commission has been worried about and fighting on this textbook front, not just Egypt, Saudi Arabia and other places as well, because we do recognize that it is important. Here's the trouble, though. Despite this improved rhetoric and some of these nice, and I don't, again, not downplaying, more than nice, meaningful, positive gestures, most of the discriminatory and repressive laws and policies remain that restrict the fundamental freedom of religion and belief of the people of Egypt. Egyptian courts continue to prosecute, convict, and imprison Egyptian citizens for blasphemy, and new government initiatives have emerged over the past year that are designed to counter atheism. Shia Islam and the Baha'i faith are also subject to these kinds of government-sponsored attacks. Copts continue to face limits on building and maintaining churches and still face sporadic violent attacks and inadequate accountability for past attacks. And there are limits on conversion from Islam to any non-Muslim faith. And look, international religious freedom, as I said at the very opening comment, includes the right to change your belief, change your affiliation, adopt a different religious view or a non-religious view as your conscience dictates. And the state continues to ban minority faiths. I mentioned those presidential decrees going back to 1960, such as the Baha'is and the Jehovah's Witnesses. So in sum, Mr. Chairman, yes, the progress is real, and the gestures are very welcome. But it's not enough, and there have been some steps backward.
All right. In your 2015 commission report, it was noted that non-state actors present a major challenge to freedom of religion or belief. Many have noted that acts of terrorism in Egypt are on the rise. My question is, how have terrorist groups like ISIS impacted the state of religious freedom in Egypt?
Well, it's a massive problem, and not simply in Egypt, but of course also in Egypt. And you know, we at USCIRF have been strongly recommending that we adjust even our legislative mandate to permit us to designate non-state actors as the equivalent of countries of particular concern. It wasn't that there was some mistake in the 1998 legislation. It's simply that the world has changed. And so we need some updating of the legislation to deal with the reality of the world changing. And one of the ways that the world has changed for the worse, of course, is the rise of the non-state actors, whether we are talking about the Islamic State in Syria and in Iraq, and of course with violence also carried out in Libya and Egypt, or we're talking about the Boko Haram in Nigeria. This has made things difficult, and let's be honest here. It's also made things difficult for states. So, whether we're talking about Iraq again, or Nigeria, or Egypt, one of the realities that makes things very difficult for leadership is dealing with these non-state actors that are perpetrating terrorism, violence in their countries. But we need them. We're asking them to do something that's hard. Still needs to be done, but it's hard, and that is to act effectively for the security of their people against private acts of violence by mobs and thugs and terrorists, while at the same time respecting the basic civil liberties of their people. We in the United States have, to some extent, ourselves had to wrestle with the security versus liberty dynamic. We want as much liberty as we can possibly have, but we know that sometimes we have to sacrifice a little bit for the sake of security. That's just part of living in a civilized society. Well, there's some real challenges when it comes to those considerations for nations like Egypt. What we don't want to see in Egypt, we don't want to see it in Russia, we don't want to see it anywhere else, is the security concerns being used as a pretext to clamp down on legitimate, nonviolent religious practitioners who, for political reasons, any particular regime just doesn't like. That's what I don't want to see anywhere.
All right, finally, there's been a lot of talk in this country about the status of the Muslim Brotherhood, whether or not it is a terrorist group. While that may be in doubt by some, I believe their role in committing human rights abuses is not in doubt. Should Congress update the International Religious Freedom Act to be able to sanction non-state actors? Would that prove useful in this scenario?
Speaking for myself here, because I cannot speak for the Commission, we have not deliberated on exactly that question, so we don't have a recommendation for you. My own view would be we do need to update legislation to deal with non-state actors. But I would urge you, with an organization such as the Muslim Brotherhood, to recognize that what we've got here is a range of views and attitudes among people who are associated with the Muslim Brotherhood. So this is one of these entities that is hard to treat as a unified actor. So I think it's very important here to just be careful in moving forward to make sure that we know who it is exactly that we are proposing to act against, and not to act against people who are not actually involved in violent extremism.
Very good. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's a privilege to have you here, and Chair now recognizes Mr. Ellison for his questions.
Thank you.
Dr. George, thanks for your very thorough and comprehensive presentation. I think you hit a number of the things I was going to ask about. Also, the Chairman Pitts was pretty comprehensive in his questioning, so I don't really have any questions for you. I simply want to say thank you for the hard work of the Commission, of raising these critical issues and giving the clear testimony that you have today. And so thank you very much, and please keep up the good work that you're doing.
Well, thank you very much, and I want to say right back at you, to you, Congressman Ellison, and you, Chairman Pitts, and to Co-Chairman McGovern. We at USCIRF not only appreciate the great work that the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission does for religious freedom, we also very much appreciate the support that you've given to us at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. As you know, we were recently reauthorized for a 4-year term on terms that we think are very good and enable us to do our work well going forward. And I want to thank you for that, and tell you that we're just going to rededicate ourselves to the cause of international religious freedom, pressing for it as vigorously as we can, and working hand in hand with you and with the non-governmental organizations and the religious groups and the diaspora groups, anyone who's willing to join hands with us to protect people across the world when it comes to the fundamental human right of religious freedom.
Thank you very much, Dr.
Thank
George.
you.
And if we have follow-up questions, we'll send them to you in writing.
Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I'll now call panel 3 to the witness table and introduce them in the order that I'd asked them to speak. First, Mr. Shadi Hamid, Senior Fellow, Center for Middle East Policy, the Brookings Institution. Let's see. I guess we're going in this direction from over here. And then Mr. Mohammed Sultan. He's an Egyptian-American activist, former political prisoner. Then Sarah Lee Whitson, Executive Director, Middle East and North Africa Division, Human Rights Watch. And finally, Daniel Callengart, Executive Vice President of Freedom House. Thank you very much for coming today. We appreciate your patience. Your written testimony will be made part of the record. We'd ask you to summarize in 5 minutes each. So at this point, Mr. Hamid, you're recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, Congressman Ellison, thank you for the opportunity to share my views with you. Let me begin by offering a framework for understanding the trajectory of human rights in Egypt. First, the level of repression under President Sisi surpasses that of Mubarak, and even, I would argue, Gamal Abdel Nasser in terms of the numbers of Egyptians killed, wounded, and detained. As autocratic as Mubarak was, he never attempted to eradicate the opposition. In contrast, repression under Sisi has been both more ambitious and totalizing, culminating in the worst mass killing in modern Egyptian history, according to Human Rights Watch. In a throwback to an older era, there have been regular reports of neighbors, colleagues, and even relatives informing on each other. Pro-regime figures have encouraged this. As former Minister of Information Osama Haikal said on national TV last year, quote unquote, "The enemy can be our own neighbor. The enemy is in our own homes." Also, something which doesn't get as much attention is that senior clerics under the Sisi regime, including state appointees, have routinely used religious rhetoric to incite violence against political opponents. The Grand Mufti at the time of the coup, Ali Goma, has employed essentially takfirist reasoning to argue that Brotherhood members are heretics and therefore their blood is licit. And I detail other examples of this rhetoric in my written testimony. He says, for example, in one military promotional video, "Blessed are those who kill them," referring here to Brotherhood members. And then there is the phenomenon of the disappeared, where security forces abduct Egyptian citizens outside and beyond the law. Human rights activists put the number of the disappeared at as high as 800. In other words, this is not your run-of-the-mill authoritarianism. There's actually no other major Arab recipient of U.S. foreign aid that actively disappears its own citizens. Now, Sisi was no Democrat, and he didn't claim to be, but he said he would bring stability. Many in the international community have echoed this narrative, that as bad as Sisi might be, at least Egypt is stable. This narrative, though, does not quite hold up to scrutiny. By any measurable standard, Egypt is now more vulnerable to violence and insurgency. The numbers are clear. In the 2 years prior to the July 2013 coup, there were a mere 78 attacks by militants, an average of 3.4 attacks per month. In the 2 years after the coup, there were 1,223 attacks, an average of 53 attacks per month, so a massive increase. This is where we are now. An ISIS affiliate has a foothold in the Sinai. Bombings are a regular occurrence in the mainland. The fact is that Sisi's heavy-handed approach to counterterrorism is fueling the very insurgency he claims to be fighting. This, unfortunately, appears to be the regime's approach to conflict resolution: more state power, more control, and more repression. Fortunately, there is more the U.S. can do. Yes, we have to be realistic. We have to work with Sisi on shared security interests. There's no way to get around that. But there is simply no reason to either legitimize or normalize Sisi's behavior by warming to him or acting as if he's just another Arab leader. Over the past year, the Obama administration has tried just that, for example, by relaunching the U.S.-Egypt strategic dialogue, yet Sisi has not reciprocated. Repression has only gotten worse. And as you know, in March, the Obama administration resumed delivery of key weapon systems. This, I would argue, was problematic, but two of the other changes are positive, at least in theory. Ending cash flow financing and channeling military assistance to 4 specific categories. This is where Congress can play an important oversight role, requiring the administration to consult and explain how this restructuring is being implemented. In my written testimony, I lay out the broader case that the U.S. enjoys more leverage than is commonly assumed. Part of the problem is that we haven't seriously attempted to use our leverage, and leverage, when unused, atrophies. The partial aid suspension of October 2013 was a suspension in name only. As the Project on Middle East Democracy's annual budget report details, Egypt still received $1.8 billion in assistance during the 8-month suspension period. In other words, we only suspended 8% of military assistance during this period, 8%. So it's not a question of if we can do it, but rather whether we want to do it. The U.S. can, in fact, hold up weapons deliveries for significant periods of time. Let us also remember that Egyptian jets and tanks cannot be serviced without U.S. maintenance and spare parts. It is not unreasonable, in my view, for the U.S. to hold back on servicing Apaches, for example, unless U.S. officials can actually see how they're being used on the battlefield. In closing, I realize that Egypt isn't a top priority today in Washington, but it should be. If there's a lesson that I have learned in studying the Middle East, it's that certain key events can have devastating long-term effects. If it's bad, it can get worse. So instead of waiting for Egypt to further destabilize, it is time to be proactive and fundamentally rethink our policy toward Egypt. Thank you.
Chair thanks the gentleman and now recognizes Mohammed Sultan for your opening statement.
Before I start, I want to take this opportunity on my own behalf and on the behalf of Egyptian Americans and everybody in this room that has come out in support of freedom and democracy in Egypt and is worried about the human rights violations. So, Mr. Chairman, Congressman Ellison, thank you very much for hosting this hearing. Thank you. My name is Mohammed Sultan. I grew up in the Midwest. I am a huge Buckeye fan. I'm very proud. And always had a dream about the Egyptian part of my identity. Having or enjoying at least some of the freedoms and liberties that my American side did. I always thought that I was a dream. My sister always tells me that I'm an idealist. So, like many of you in this room, I was ecstatic to see that January 25th, to see young Egyptian youth take the streets and peacefully request and ask and demand their right to freedom and liberty. So, on the 29th of January, I took myself, went to Egypt, and joined the protests. I came back to the States, finished my education at the Ohio State, and unfortunately, my mother was diagnosed with cancer. My father was the Deputy Minister of Islamic Endowment in the Morsi government. So I quit my job, and my sister quit her job, and we went down to take care of our mother and my sick brother who has a chronic disease. Out of principle, I joined the Rab'a Sirin as a translator, just kind of blogging, tweeting. I witnessed both massacres that led up to the Rab'a massacre. I was shot after a bullet had missed my head, and just minutes after, 2 cameramen had taken shots to the head. 11 days later, while I was recovering at home, I got arrested. May 30th, earlier this year, I was released after 21 months in prison. 5.5 months, I'm before you today. Sometimes, a lot of times, I still have trouble sleeping. It's not because of the physical torture that I had to go through in prison. It's not that I had to go through an impromptu surgery, an underground dungeon by a cellmate who was a doctor, who cut me open from my elbow and from my shoulder to extract with pliers 2 nails that were in my arm. It wasn't that I was handcuffed at some point to my wheelchair after I started a hunger strike to protest my detention and beaten into submission so that I can give my vitals to security officers. It wasn't that. It wasn't also the psychological torture that I had to endure for 5.5 to 6 months, where I was placed in a room in complete and utter isolation with no windows, with no reading material, no clock, nothing at all. It wasn't all that. It was the fact, and I think this is the hardest part for every prisoner, is the fact that you go to sleep and you're dreaming, you're out and about, you're doing everything that you've always wanted to do, but then you wake up to the dark, gloomy reality of being in an underground dungeon thousands of miles away from the place you know as home. That detention is renewed every single day. Until today, I feel like this is all a dream. And I have a very, very hard time sleeping. Now, this is just a quick snapshot of some of the things that I went through. There was obviously systematic psychological torture where my father was used against me as a weapon, torture by proxy, where guards pass razors from under the door so that they can, and I was explicitly told to relieve myself from them of the headache. It wasn't all that. This is what I've gone through, and this happened under some U.S. oversight. The U.S. Embassy was visiting me. Now one can only imagine what 40,000 political prisoners in there, youth from all across the ideological and political spectrum, are going through systematic psychological, and physical torture on a daily basis. See, I'm telling you my story as the human person behind the suits, behind the person that takes off the suit and goes home to his wife, to his kids. And all of these things are enough to give us a sense of moral urgency to demand a change. As Chairman, you said earlier, that our interests are not mutually exclusive with our principles. And some may argue that, the human rights violations are an unfortunate price for securing our interests. But from what I've experienced is that this war on terror facade, this cosmetic measure that the regime has, it's allocating, like what was said earlier in the previous panelists, that it's misallocating the resources that it has to cracking down on political opposition rather than effectively combating extremism. And to give you an example of that, on March 16th, earlier this year, my father, a journalist, and 12 others were sentenced to death. On the same day, a man that has confessed to that same judge in front of us that he had pledged allegiance to the Islamic State, as he called it, that man got released and 14 people got the death sentence, including my father. This, for me, this was the epitome of just irrationality. Nothing made sense at that point. So not only is the current environment in Egypt where the crackdown on any political dissent, there's no room for, there's no space for dialogue, no space for anything. NGOs, notable NGOs have been driven out. Journalists are not allowed to report anything but the state narrative, otherwise they are either put in prison or fined. New terrorism law. I'm not a policy guy, so I don't want to get into much more credible people here on this panel to explain to you the details of this. But from what I felt, there's no room. And so not only is the current government, not only is the environment not effectively combating extremism, but what we as a prisoner, what we had faced inside and saw when there's no room, it's already like a pressure cooker with no outlet. But not only is it that, but there's a growing disbelief in democracy and freedom model, and people are exposed, young disenfranchised Egyptians are exposed to recruitment efforts inside of prison. Now, that, let's not forget, again, as some points were made, where the Al-Qaeda came out of those same Torah prisons in the 80s, and its latest mutation is ISIL or ISIS, whatever they call themselves. Now, we've tried supporting authoritarian regimes for 3 decades. It hasn't worked. I don't understand why would it work now. And as Assistant Secretary Tom Malnowski said, me standing here before you today, I'm living proof that we have leverage and we could use it. I'm living proof of that. So my main point, I guess, is whether you put the policy-making hat on or take it off, our principles are our interests, as you so eloquently put it in the beginning. So I believe that it's largely beneficial for the U.S. interests, economic, political, security interests, for stability in Egypt and in the region, for the fight against extremism, real effective fighting against extremism, for democracy, as that you make public statements urging the Egyptian authorities to release all political prisoners. There are at least 7 dual citizens, 5 Americans that I know that are still in prison, over 20 journalists, 176 ex-MPs, tens of ex-officials, hundreds of academics, and thousands of youth languishing in unspeakable conditions. I wanted to share some pictures with you today from inside of prison, but technical difficulties, I will submit them in print. This not only gives the Egyptian regime notice when there are people that are spoken out, are vocal, that the world is watching. It knows what's going on. It recognizes that, but it also slows down that process of disbelief in democracy. I mean, I remember being on the receiving end of some terrible news that the world has abandoned. But I had the hunger strike as an outlet to resist both oppression and radicalization, and I had the background and experience of democracy having lived here my whole life. Most Egyptian political prisoners don't have that. So I only hung on to hope when I almost lost faith, because I knew that there were people out there that had not abandoned their principles. And there are 40,000 political prisoners that are looking for that. I also urge you to demand that the Egyptian regime be held accountable in a manner that is proportionate to the massive aid we provide as a major ally in an important region. I also urge you to pass the Egypt language that's currently in the Senate FY16 appropriations bill. The language on Egypt's military aid would require all political prisoners be released. An additional global language would require a list of American citizens imprisoned as prisoners of conscience abroad. Ensuring both of these is included in the final version of the bill is very, very important. You know, despite the gloomy reality, my father actually now he's being targeted because of me being outspoken. He's actually in a cell with no bathroom. He's handcuffed 24 hours a day, and he's beaten on a daily basis. My father is on death row. I was not allowed to see him before I came. 3 of my journalist friends are serving a life sentence, the ones that were with me at my home. Ala Abdel Fattah, Ahmed Maher, Mahi Noor, Isra al-Tawil. Thousands of political prisoners, thousands of youth are languishing in these prisons. And despite the gloomy reality that is Egypt now, I'm very hopeful. I'm hopeful because the youth of Egypt have not given up on their dream for freedom. And to them, I dedicate this testimony. Thank you very much.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Chair, thanks, gentlemen, for your very eloquent, moving testimony. Now the chair recognizes Sarah Whitson, 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you to the chairman for organizing this hearing and inviting me to comment. And actually also want to thank so many Egyptian Americans in the audience here today who have very direct and personal experience of abuses of Egypt's security forces, not just Mohammed Sultan, but so many here who have personally lost friends and family in the demonstrations and protests which the government has refused to tolerate and responded quite violently to. So thank you for your continued faith in democracy and rights and your faith in the U.S. government and that it will do the right thing by the Egyptian people, first and foremost. We are on the heels of the first phase of elections for Egypt's new parliament, an exercise that Cairo has promoted as the final step on a roadmap that guides its so-called transition to democracy. The blessing that our Secretary of State, John Kerry, bestowed on this roadmap shortly after the military's removal of former President Mohamed Morsi regrettably reinforced its international legitimacy. But the transition's true nature has since revealed itself. It is the reemergence of a military-led authoritarianism that has rolled back Egyptian public life to a state of repression that has not been seen in decades, if ever. The facts of the repression that followed Morsi's removal are probably known to this committee and touched on by the panelists today, but worth stating again here for the public record. In its efforts to crush those who resisted the military takeover, the Egyptian government planned and executed a systematic violent incursion of two sit-ins of over 100,000 people in Rabaa and Al-Nahda squares, leaving at least 1,150 people dead. Likely, as was noted, the gravest mass killing of demonstrators in world history, exceeding even Tiananmen Square, and crimes against humanity. The government did not prosecute a single officer, much less a senior official, for these killings, instead erecting a statue to honor the police at the site of the main protest dispersal in Rabaa Square and renaming it after a slain prosecutor general involved in implementing the plan. Quite an insult to the victims. In the wake of the coup, Egyptian security forces have detained, charged, or sentenced at least 41,000 people. And the numbers are important because we're talking about human beings. Between July 2013 and April 2014, mostly because of their alleged support for or association with the Muslim Brotherhood, according to the most thorough research undertaken by activists on the ground. They have faced a laundry list of generically applied charges, in large part relating to their participation in demonstrations. At least 670 people have received death sentences in cases connected to political opposition or alleged violence since Morsi's removal, most of them following mass trials that relied solely on the testimony of officers in the security services and made no effort to establish actual individual guilt. Egyptian military courts have charged or sentenced at least 3,700 civilians, including students, professors, and children, since October 2014, when El-Sisi decreed an expansion of military court jurisdiction to cover all public space in Egypt for a period of 2 years, which we are certain, in fact, will be extended. Egypt's military courts deny defendants the rights to be informed of the charges against them, access to a lawyer, and to be promptly before a judge following arrest. At least 124 people have died in the custody of the security services between July 2013 and June 2015, including lawyers and former members of parliament. Prisons and police holding cells are incredibly overcrowded, creating lethal conditions such as those Mohammed just described today, especially for inmates with medical problems. The Interior Ministry's National Security Agency, notoriously known as State Security until its rebranding following the 2011 revolution, has disappeared suspects for days or months at a time. Local human rights groups continue to allege the regular use of torture by police and national security agents. In January of this year, a major human rights law firm said that its lawyers had handled 465 cases of torture between October 2013 and August 2014, including 129 beatings that led to death. Nearly 24 journalists are still behind bars, a record number according to the Committee to Protect Journalists. A law decreed by Sisi provides for life imprisonment for any NGO member who receives foreign funding with a vaguely defined goal of harming the nation's interests, however some judge decides to interpret that. Several major non-governmental organizations are currently under investigation. Other Egyptian and international NGOs, including Human Rights Watch, have shut down their offices, and some activists, not already jailed, have fled the country. The new counterterrorism law grants the government authority to prosecute crimes under a definition of terrorism that is so broadly worded it could encompass civil disobedience. It makes it a crime to publish or promote news about terrorism if it contradicts the Defense Ministry's official statements, and would allow the courts to ban journalists from practicing their profession for a year for doing so. It makes anyone judged to have facilitated, incited, or agreed to any vaguely defined terrorist crime, whether in public or private, liable for the same penalty as if they had committed the crime, even if the crime doesn't occur. Egypt has arbitrarily banned scores of lawyers, scholars, politicians, and activists from traveling abroad, providing no opportunity for them to challenge the basis of the ban against them. The authorities have prevented Khaled al-Qazzaz, a former foreign policy advisor to Morsi, from traveling outside Egypt. His family members are here today attending this hearing in hopes of drawing attention to this unjust situation and his urgent medical condition. The military arrested al-Qazzaz along with other Morsi aides in July of 2013 and held them incommunicado for more than 5 months. They never charged al-Qazzaz with a crime and finally released him in January of this year on medical grounds after the prosecutor general cleared him of all charges, his family has told us. Nevertheless, the government has refused to allow him from leaving the country. In the Sinai Peninsula, the government has mostly demolished the town of Rafah at the Gaza border, destroying thousands of homes and forcibly evicting thousands of families after declaring a staggering, unheard of 79 square kilometer buffer zone. The government's dubious counterterrorism strategy appears to be making little progress against the growing threat of the Islamic State affiliate in the area. Over 3,600 people have died in Sinai, a territory of 500,000 people, just in the past 2 years. And it's unclear what gains the government has to show for this. It's a particularly dangerous moment as the Egyptian government plays politics with the facts, attempting to connect the Muslim Brotherhood to the violence of the Islamic State and other extremist groups with no evidence whatsoever. What makes this dire reversal of the 2011 uprising more discouraging is that it has unfolded in full view of world powers that claim to hold human rights in high esteem and has been met by their acquiescence. The United States flouted a key law aimed at punishing military takeovers by refusing to label Morsi's removal a coup. Rather than condemn the usurpation of power from the Egyptian people, Secretary Kerry bizarrely lauded the coup as restoring democracy. In 2011, President Obama promised to shift American policies away from standing with dictators and towards supporting people's aspirations for freedom and democracy, even assuring us in 2013 that we would not return to business as usual with a post-coup Egypt. Yet these promises have been broken, and we have very much returned to business as usual. Administration diplomats insist that they raise human rights concerns with el-Sisi's government at every level, that criticizing Egypt in public is counterproductive, and, of course, that the U.S. lacks leverage over Egypt. Some of this might be true, but the public record suggests that this administration views the rights of Egyptian citizens as an afterthought in its pursuit of an outdated regional security methodology. As recently as October 29, as Egypt received 4 American F-16s, the U.S. ambassador in Cairo stated that the delivery was another step forward in U.S.-Egyptian cooperation on fighting terror, bringing stability to the region, and strengthening our historic relationship. The ongoing military and political support for the Sisi government should not be seen merely as a tool of leverage. The U.S. should recognize that this support acts as an endorsement for the Egyptian government and its unjust and inhumane repression, and to many in the Middle East, makes the administration appear complicit in that government's abuses. This, too, is a national security threat that the U.S. should take into consideration. In order to refocus its Egypt policy on basic principles that support the rule of law, or at the very least, mitigate its support for a government engaged in the most serious human rights abuses, the United States should take the following steps. It should continue the progress made in March when President Obama announced changes to Egypt's military aid policy by reducing the dollar amount of military aid and increasing support to civil society, exchange programs, and other non-governmental initiatives. These changes could include new targeted economic aid and be conditioned on human rights progress, specifically the release of political detainees and freedom for journalists and independent organizations to do their work without harassment. The U.S. should support action at the United Nations to hold Egyptian authorities accountable, particularly because they have failed to do so miserably themselves, including an international commission of inquiry into the mass killings of 2013. The complete impunity of security forces only fuels grievances and further violence, as so many panelists today have advised. And finally, we should ensure that the U.S. government, specifically the Cairo Embassy's defense attaché, has wider access to the northern Sinai Peninsula, where the Egyptian military has used American equipment in its opaque counterterrorism campaign, including to destroy civilian homes. This access should go beyond visits to the main North Camp of the multinational forces and observers, where we understand even U.S. observers have been limited, and which do not satisfy Leahy law requirements that the State Department periodically update procedures to identify units involved in human rights violations. Thank you for your attention.
Chair, Chair thanks the gentlelady and now recognizes Mr. Daniel Callengart. 5 minutes for your summary.
Chairman Pitts, Congressman Ellison, thank you for your leadership in drawing attention to the issue of human rights in Egypt. My written testimony details the wide-ranging and brutal campaign of repression against the fundamental rights of Egyptians. What I'd like to focus on now is the impact of that campaign and what the U.S. should do about it. Egypt has grown less stable since el-Sisi seized power. I'd like to draw your attention, it was in my written testimony, and you may have a copy of a chart we put together showing the incidence of terrorist attacks in Egypt, and I think the picture is plenty clear. What you've heard described by the other witnesses, and it's also in my written testimony, I would say it amounts to a campaign of state violence against citizens in Egypt. And it's a concerted effort to crush the political opposition, crush civil society, and muzzle independent voices in the media and for individuals speaking out on political issues. And by leaving few if any avenues, for people to engage in peaceful ways to assert their rights and to have a say in their country's future, the current campaign of repression is actually fueling unrest and further instability. What should the United States do? We should focus on using our leverage more effectively to persuade President el-Sisi to reverse course. I'd suggest several ways to do so. First, reduce military assistance. In the 1980s, the ratio of U.S. military to economic aid to Egypt was about $1.50 for each dollar. Now, the ratio is more than 8 to 1. This is a heavy emphasis on support for Egypt's military at a time when a military-dominated government is conducting a harsh campaign of repression. And this makes the United States look complicit. And it also appears that we are subsidizing a failed policy that is generating more instability. The U.S. government should start to restructure its aid package to bring military and economic aid to Egypt more into balance. Second, we should set rigorous conditions for U.S. aid. U.S. credibility in calling on the Egyptian government to respect human rights is often undermined by business as usual. Conditions on aid have become, for the most part, an empty threat. Congress should make these conditions credible. It should mandate a delay or reduction in military assistance if the Egyptian government fails to meet U.S. conditions. Third, we should press Egypt to overturn the convictions of the 43 NGO workers, including some of my former colleagues at Freedom House, who were unjustly sentenced 2 years ago in a politically motivated trial. These convictions still stand in Egypt. They force Egyptian citizens who worked for American NGOs to remain in exile. They hang over American and international staff, and they cast a shadow over current U.S. programs to support democracy in Egypt. The State Department appears to have moved on. It is thereby sending an unfortunate signal that the U.S. government won't stick up for the people who carry out the programs that it funds. Fourth, Congress should bring attention to the situation of political prisoners, speaking out for the individuals and for political prisoners generally in Egypt, pressing for their release publicly and in your conversations with Egyptian officials, and where possible, visit them when you travel to Egypt. Fifth, pass the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act. It would impose U.S. visa bans and asset freezes on foreign officials responsible for human rights abuses, such as Egyptian commanders who have ordered security forces to fire on peaceful demonstrators, prison officials who authorized the torture of detainees, or judges who have convicted dissidents or imposed death sentences in mass trials that lack due process. By imposing penalties on foreign officials who have carried out abuses with impunity, the Global Magnitsky Act is likely to deter future human rights abuses. The spiral of repression and violence is taking Egypt down a dangerous path of instability. President el-Sisi shows little sign of allowing meaningful political participation or tolerating dissent, and jihadi violence rages on. He is dragging Egypt down, and the reputation and interests of the United States down with it. Rather than continue to subsidize his failed policy, the United States should align its actions more closely to its words of support for democracy and human rights in Egypt. We should reduce the emphasis in the bilateral relationship and the aid package on the Egyptian military and take visible steps to distance ourselves from the perpetrators of human rights abuses. Better yet, the United States should use its leverage more effectively to persuade President el-Sisi to respect the rights of Egypt's citizens and include them in charting the country's future. Thank you.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Thank you. Each of you have given us specific recommendations that are very helpful. I'll begin questioning and go in the order of the presentation. So, Mr. Hamid, do you believe that Egyptian efforts to quash Islamist and secular opposition forces will ultimately create a violent backlash against the government and or the United States? How valid are Egyptian officials' arguments that such measures are necessary to counter domestic militancy and maintain internal stability?
Thank you. Well, the first step of counterterrorism is correctly identifying who the terrorists actually are, and the fact that the Egyptian regime is devoting so much attention and resources towards not just the Muslim Brotherhood. We're not just talking about Islamists here, but also young liberals, socialists, leftists, instead of on ISIS, instead of the people in the Sinai who were actually the ones responsible for the vast majority of attacks. You know, but it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if people, and we know this from the academic literature, that if people feel that they are closed off from any political outlets, that they have no way to express their grievances through the democratic process, then at least some of them will resort to violence, and we're seeing signs of that. So this kind of radicalization, which Mohammed Sultan talked about, which is happening inside Egypt's prisons, is something we have to watch, I think, very, very closely going forward. You know, I would also say that there is a widespread perception that the U.S. is backing the Sisi regime, that the U.S. has not been as forceful in its condemnations, that we are, in effect, on the wrong side of history. So what I'm worried about is that really for decades to come, this will be the perception of young Egyptians, the people who will be the future of this country, are going to remember our silence and, in some ways, complicity with the kinds of repressive acts that have happened. And this is, I think, what a lot of us warned about during the time of the coup. I mean, this was not unpredictable. It was, in fact, predicted by most of us in the think tank community, by most academics who focus on these issues, that by ending the democratic process, and let's also be frank about this, the Morsi government was pretty lousy at governing. They did harass and intimidate their opponents. But the badness, let's say, of the Morsi government should not justify the repression that is happening now against Morsi administration officials, against the Muslim Brotherhood. So we should separate that. So we don't have to like the Muslim Brotherhood. As Americans, I think many of us profoundly disagree with some of their ideas. But there is something called due process, and there is something called that even if you disagree with people, they have a right to express their grievances politically. Lastly, I'll just say that there was one group that was celebrating the military coup in Egypt. So it wasn't just Sisi and liberals and secularists who opposed the Brotherhood in Egypt, but also ISIS. And one of ISIS's earliest statements in August 2013, a month after the coup, I'd recommend that people go to this document. There's a section on the Muslim Brotherhood where they essentially say, our way has been vindicated. Look at those bankrupt Brotherhood people. Their model of participating in the democratic process has failed miserably. So what ISIS is telling young Egyptians is, look, democracy doesn't work. They will never let you come to power through free and fair elections. The only way to achieve an Islamic state is through brute force. And I worry that ISIS's message is being vindicated day in and day out if people continue to see, not just in Egypt, but throughout the region, that democratic openings are being closed.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Sultan, you mentioned your father was in prison, I think you said on death row. Now, he was an official in the Morsi government, right? So he's a political prisoner, but why was he sentenced to death?
So in the case that I have a finalized life sentence in, my father and a journalist, my friend Omar Malik, and 11 others were sentenced to death. Let me give you just a little bit of a quick, what's it called, about the case that we're in. Our case is called Case 317. It's known as the Rab'a Operation Room. Sounds really scary, but it's not. What happened was the charges that were brought against us, and I have this in my written testimony, is the exact same charges that the Al Jazeera staff was charged with. We were actually transferred to the exact same judicial circuit, and we were tried in front of the same judge. What happened was there was an international outcry about the Al Jazeera staff. So the charge, just so what's called the usual, being a member of a terrorist organization, this da-da-da, but the main kind of charge was spreading false information internationally to shake the majesty of the state. So that's the exact same charge. There was not a shred of evidence that was provided for anybody. Actually, 5 of the 51 defendants in the case were not given true representation. Their lawyers did not give any statements. The trial was rushed, and we were surprised one hearing, 14 people got sentenced to death, and me and 38 others or 37 others were sentenced to life. So again, when a lot of people ask me, having, again, lived my whole life in a systematic society and, that abides by the rule of law, you can't really think of anything that happens in Egypt, especially, after the coup in any logical or rational or systematic sense. You just kind of just take it for what it is.
Now, during your testimony, you said something, I believe, in Arabic.
Oh, sorry.
Did you, or were those names of prisoners?
Yes, those are friends that I encountered, that I've gotten to know inside of prisons.
Okay.
That all people from all across the political and ideological spectrum. Al Abd Fattah is the revolution's icon. There's also Ahmed Maher, who's the head of the 6th of April movement. Also, Isra al-Tawil, who's honestly a child, who's, I wish there was an image that, that we were able to fix. Also called, there's an image of her just yesterday. She's a 20-year-old child, she's 18-year-old girl that got shot during the revolution, 2011, and is on crutches. And they picked her up, literally, she was having dinner in Chili's, and they picked her up. She disappeared for, I can't remember how many days, and she showed up, and they just keep renewing her detention. And again, indefinite temporary holding, again, doesn't make sense, but that's Egypt. And there's a truly horrifying image of her yesterday crying in court because, again, trying to make sense of anything just doesn't work. So,
Well, thank you for mentioning those names. One final question for you, Mr. Sultan. Are there any indications that the government is willing to ease up on its crackdown and release political prisoners?
So again, I'm not a political analyst, so I'm going to try to answer that question from my personal experience. I was released on May 30th, 2015. July 1st, my aunt's husband was assassinated in the 6th of October city in an extrajudicial killing. He was one of 9. And when my aunt and the cousins went to pick him up, 3 girls and a 15-year-old boy, 3 of his fingers were cut off. Not only is the regime not maintaining its repression like Mubarak and his presidents did, the regime continues to escalate in its repression in an unprecedented way. And that is because it is not facing any real consequences for its escalation in its repression. It feels like anything that the international community is giving it a green light to do as it wishes, to kill thousands of people, to imprison tens of thousands of young Egyptians. Egypt's future, you have a country that's 60% under the age of 29, very, very young country. To imprison a country's future is to destroy it. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, very good. Thank you very much. Appreciate your testimony. Ms. Whitson, what are some of the types of human rights violations that your organization has documented in Egypt? And what components of the Egypt security forces does your organization believe perpetrated these violations?
Well, the most significant, because of the magnitude of the crimes that we documented, and that remains really the largest blemish on the history of Egypt, is the mass killing of demonstrators in August of 2013. when the government planned and executed a plan to violently disperse people who were conducting a sit-in Rabaa and Nahdha squares. And what we documented is that the government planned this violent assault weeks in advance, knowing and anticipating that it would result in thousands and thousands of deaths. The number of people they actually killed was less than the number of people they anticipated killing. And this was in broad daylight. It was directed indiscriminately, with security forces firing from rooftops, in certain cases evidence pointing that they're firing from helicopters, in certain cases murdering those who had been injured with bullet wounds, setting fire to protest camps, and so forth, with this unbelievable death toll. And with complete impunity. So that is, I think, the taking of human life stands, of course, as the worst of abuses. We have tried to monitor as closely as we can the mass trials that have resulted in the mass death sentences. We continue to monitor the cases of those who are still detained, typically in form of administrative detention, pretrial detention with these rather bogus charges against them. And the crackdown on civil society, the crackdown on journalists, the crackdown on NGOs is also something that we document. Just this week, we put out a press release on the government's extensive use of travel bans, effectively turning the entire country into a prison from which Egyptians can't leave if the government doesn't like their point of view.
Thank you, Mr. Collingart. In June of 2013, an Egyptian court convicted 43 employees from 4 U.S. non-governmental organizations and a German organization of operating unauthorized organizations in Egypt. To date, these judicial rulings stand. My question is, what steps should be taken by the U.S. government to seek redress on behalf of the 43 convicted individuals?
I think I think the U.S. government should demand that the convictions be reversed. The State Department called the trial a politically motivated trial. These convictions are not recognized for purposes of U.S. law, but as I detailed in my testimony, they're damaging, certainly for the individuals involved, but for more broadly, the efforts for American civil society and Egyptian civil society to work together. We have a lot of leverage, from our aid package to the military relationship, everything we've talked about, and I don't see that we've used it.
Be a little bit more specific about the tools that Congress and the administration should use to advance human rights and democracy in Egypt.
Well, I think the military aid is probably one of the first tools to start with. $1.3 billion, as Congressman Ellison said it in his opening remarks. This is taxpayer money. We have a direct interest in how it is spent, and you know, the way it's being spent.
So, would you condition that aid or restrict it or reduce it?
We've had conditions. The problem, as I see it, is that year after year there have been conditions in the appropriations language and a national security waiver. And with one brief exception, the waiver has always been invoked and the aid continues. And so it's turned into an empty threat. I mean, we can keep going through this charade again and again, but every time we say, we're really serious about these conditions, but, you know, if we have to for national security reasons, we'll waive them. I think the Egyptian government expect that, you know, we'll huff and puff, but at the end of the day, it's not going to change anything for them. And so there are different ways to do it. We can remove the national security waiver. I think that would be a bit too rigid. But there are gradations. It doesn't have to be, you know, complete shutoff, but maybe have a redirect or a certain percentage or a certain delay. And I think also tied to public reports on the human rights and democracy conditions in Egypt, so that the State Department is required to detail what is going on and put that out there for the public record, and that report affect the decisions on how much military aid gets through and how quickly.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. And now recognize gentleman, Mr. Ellison, for his questions.
Let me just thank everybody on the panel for that very moving testimony. Mr. Sultan, while you were in prison for 21 months, did you get a chance to observe how the prison authorities treated you and other nonviolent protesters versus how they treated people who were known to be affiliated with Al-Qaeda and ISIS?
In a ward in Liman Tura, and that's the prison, the maximum security prison that I was in, I was placed in this ward that had a very diverse group of people. I had some of the secular and liberal activists. It also had some of the Muslim Brotherhood, and it also had some of the ISIS or ISIL members. And at some point, when the government or the Security Ministry of Interior had kind of given up on trying to convince me to shy away from my nonviolent means of resistance through the hunger strike, the ISIS guys were pushed on me to try to convince me of that same argument that has been made over and over again today, that this nonviolent stuff doesn't work. The world only understands the language of power, that might makes right, and that how my government had given up on me. So that should kind of give you an idea. Again, I don't like to talk in theory and in abstract terms. I like to speak with my own experience. So that can give you an idea of the kind of room they were given as opposed to other folks.
Were they given any kind of privileges that the nonviolent protesters were denied?
I don't. I don't know. I spent a lot of time in my own cell because I just had no energy.
Okay.
But so like I wasn't exposed to that. So again, I don't want to speak something that I didn't see. But
Sure.
again, to have that kind of, people coming into my room and having that kind of, because my room was watched at all times. So to be allowed to enter my room as opposed to others that weren't given that, what's it called, just kind of gave me an idea. But I can't speak to that because there are also other reports of people, that are getting terrible treatment in prison all across. So again, I don't know if I can answer that from my own experience completely.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Hamid, if we do use tools at our disposal to, say, stop military aid, take other actions, is there a legitimate concern that that other governments in the region who really don't want a free democratic Egypt next door to them will just backfill with weapons and money?
So this is actually one of the misconceptions that I hear a lot, and people always tell me, well, Shadi, if we condition aid or reduce aid, then Saudi Arabia or the UAE will fill the gap. They can do that, but only on economic assistance, not on military provisions. There is actually no substitute for U.S. military provisions. I mean, and of course, Saudi Arabia and the UAE receive their military weaponry from the U.S., so let's just keep that in mind as well. Sometimes the Egyptians will threaten to kind of go towards Russia, but I think we should call their bluff. It's very hard to take that seriously. I don't know of any government that would want to switch from the prestige of the U.S. military relationship and the state-of-the-art weaponry and move towards Russia. And there's also the question of interoperability of weapon systems. Even if hypothetically they wanted to move to Russian weapons, they really wouldn't be able to, because everything they have now are U.S. weapon systems. So, so I think that's why it's very important to make a distinction between economic and military assistance.
So let me ask you
Yeah.
about economic aid. How would it affect the average workaday Egyptian if economic aid from the United States were cut?
So I'm not actually a big proponent of cutting economic aid. There are different kinds of economic assistance. There's ways to target economic assistance so it actually helps Egyptians and doesn't go to the cronies of the regime. And we can have, reasonable people can disagree on how exactly to do that. I do think, however, that we should resist any additional economic support. And that doesn't have to be through direct aid. That can be through business delegations. That could be through our relationship with the IMF and the World Bank. There's no reason to give Egypt more as repression is getting worse. And we can also use our leverage with our European allies, many of whom are dealing with the same kinds of debates about economic assistance.
Now, Dr. Hamid, I've read your work for years, and I really respect it. But I have had many Egyptian friends of mine, and I have tons of them, who have said that the economic aid that we give to the government of Egypt doesn't really get down to the average person in terms of educational. I've just heard that. It's anecdotes. Would you like to respond to that?
That's actually to a large extent true, which is why I'm saying we have to rethink how we do economic assistance and find the ways to actually get it to the Egyptian people.
Right.
And, that's a conversation that I think that we have to have. But I think at the very least, we have to be realistic. I'm not arguing that anything we're going to do is going to make Sisi democratic. That is not one of the options that's in front of us right now. My hope is actually quite modest, is to at least induce him to be somewhat less repressive and to at least have some small openings in the Egyptian public arena. I think that is actually realistic. And I think that as as other witnesses have said, the fact that whenever we're in a staring contest with the Sisi regime, we always blink first. That's why our leverage and our threats, if you will, don't actually come out to much, because the Sisi regime knows that when push comes to shove, we're going to back down. We're not going to actually follow through. And this is where the credibility of America's word has really come into question. They know they can get away with it. And that didn't start with Sisi. It started, I would put the real kind of turning point here in spring 2012, when they waged war on our American citizens, on our American NGOs, as well as, of course, on Egyptian NGOs. And we actually let them get away with it to the extent that American citizens were holed up in the U.S. Embassy being threatened with arrest, and they had to flee the country. That was the first test of our resolve. And I actually remember talking to someone in government saying, well, why don't we think about using our military assistance as leverage? And I remember this person said, well, we're saving our leverage for when it really matters. So I asked, when do you think it will really matter? And they said, in the event of a military coup. So it's kind of, when I look back at that conversation, and then when the military coup happened, I heard the same thing from U.S. officials. We want to save our leverage for when it gets worse. We had the first massacre, the second massacre, the Rabaa massacre. At some point, for U.S. leverage to matter, there has to be, I hate to use this term because it's a red line. There has to be a place where we say, you will pay a price if you continue going along this route.
Many good questions to be asked. I know we're running low on time, but I would like to just ask Mr. Gallagher and Ms. Whitson the same question, and that is going to this issue of these 43 convictions. First, was the son of the former Secretary of Transportation among those 43 convicted? So Joe LaHood, whose father was a colleague of ours, and at the time was the Secretary of Transportation's son, was charged, convicted, and had to run out of the country. I mean, that's what happened, right? Oh, yeah. Now, let me just tell you, I was in a meeting a few months before this whole thing went down with a senior official in the Egyptian government, a woman named Faiza Abu Naga. I don't know if y'all ever heard. I don't know if y'all ever heard of this lady or not.
Oh, yeah.
She says they don't have a license to operate, and I remember saying, "Then put them out of the country." Then she says, "No, no government would ever do this. No government would allow people to operate without a license." I said, "Fine. So give them a license or deny them the license, but don't just let it float like that. If they're persona non grata, flights leaving Cairo every day." She didn't want it either way. She wanted to keep it in the middle zone to try to gain compliance. And I heard we had increased our democracy assistance and it didn't flow through her hands anymore. Is any of that accurate? I mean, is that, I guess you don't know because I was the one who was there, but does anything I said strike you as correct based on your own experience?
I saw a different angle of it, but it sounds very familiar, and I would make 3 points. The party institutes, so the National Democratic Institute and the International Republican Institute, applied for registration in Egypt years before they were shut down. And my understanding is they had a verbal commitment from the then foreign minister that this was routine, it would go ahead in a matter of weeks. And it dragged on for years. And I think that that was very deliberate on the part of the Egyptian government. They wanted to keep this in limbo so they could say, well, we're not shutting them down, but, you know, they could always sort of hold over them the fact that they never received legal registration. For this very reason, Freedom House, this is during the Mubarak period, did not even apply for registration in Egypt because we knew same thing would happen to us. So in fact, we operated from elsewhere in the region, and when we did training seminars or other events in Egypt, it was always in partnership with one or more Egyptian civil society organizations, all done openly. The issue of the NGO workers, you know, the problem was with Sam LaHood and the others that I think the State Department treated the problem as we just need to get these people out of harm's way. So, you know, when they're holed up in the embassy, there's obviously some deal cut, get the Americans out of the country, and then treat it like, okay, problem is solved. And I would say that's a very dangerous way of looking at it because the bigger issue is the U.S. credibility. And it's not just about the Americans. Among those 43 were people of many different nationalities, including Egyptians and including at least several Egyptians who are still in exile to this day. And all of this is because they worked on democracy support programs funded by the U.S. government. So it's not U.S. government personnel, but it's still pretty close to, let's say, our people that we're not sticking up for. And the last point I'd want to make, if I could, we knew from the beginning that when they started, even before they raided our offices, there was a, let's say, campaign of vilification in the press about our organizations.
Right.
And we were even commenting at that point, it was very clear this was simply a step one to go after Egyptian civil society organizations. And that was really, you know, if they could basically push the Americans out of the way, then it would be much easier to go after Egyptian human rights defenders.
Which brings me to my final question with Ms. Whitson. Ms. Whitson, how is it now for democracy organizations to operate? I mean, your organization is trying to function. Are you getting cooperation with the Egyptian government? Is it difficult to do the work that you all do in documenting human rights and raising the issues? What's the environment like now?
The environment is certainly the worst that we've ever seen in our decades of working in Egypt, on the ground in Egypt, including having been forced to shut down our office because of the similar games that they played with Freedom House, not accepting our registration and keeping us dangling, having security officers threateningly intimidate our staff and hang outside our office. We have actually been denied entry to the country. I was deported with my colleague Ken Roth from the airport in Egypt when we came to release our report on Rabah, and the government promised to invite us, but has not. This, of course, is much worse for the domestic human rights organizations, the most prominent of which, the Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies, shuttered its office and moved outside the country. Many democratic human rights activists have fled the country, and of course some have been jailed. And this is really the double game that Egypt and its government continues to play, because inside Egypt, in the Egyptian-controlled press, they portray the United States as supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood and, of course, supporters of ISIS, while at the same time have their hand out to receive their payments and support from the U.S. And I think in terms of the military aid, as some of the question you touched on, the military aid, which predates ISIS, the billions in aid that the U.S. has been giving, is not important to Egypt purely militarily. In fact, I think the least important part of the military aid we give is the military interest and military need that Egypt has. It is the stamp of legitimacy and the stamp of approval that aid suggests. And that's why it's so important to the Egyptian government. And the challenge, of course, is it flies in the face of what President Obama has made a priority of U.S. strategic interest, which is combating violent extremism. So much of the rhetoric of that campaign is about recognizing the repression that creates violent extremism, and yet the policies of the U.S. government are doing exactly that, supporting a repressive government that every single expert, every single academic, every single scholar, every single activist has said very clearly to the United States government is fueling the violent extremism. So what can we do to better align the U.S. stated interest, priority of combating violent extremism when we're supporting a government that fuels violent extremism?
Chair, thanks to gentlemen. Thank you again to the witnesses for your very important testimony, and for all of my colleagues' efforts in coming together for this important meeting. Chairman McGovern has asked that his written opening statement be made a part of the record without objection, so ordered. As we have just explored, the human rights challenges facing Egypt are immense, and this being the case, I believe the United States must double down on our relationship with Egypt. I'm a member of Congress that has welcomed President Obama's recent recalibration on releasing select weapon systems within our security assistance. At the same time, we need to be finding new ways to promote the human rights norms that have been violated so systematically under Mubarak, Morsi, and al-Sisi governments. I hope this Congress passes legislation like the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act so that our government can more directly go after individuals within the complicated fabric of threats to Egyptian society. I further call on Congress to reform the International Religious Freedom Act to sanction non-state actors for severe violations of religious freedom. I call on Egypt, the Egyptian government, to release the 43 employees of the NGOs who are prisoners. I call on the Egyptian government to take all political prisoners, including Mr. Sultan's father, off of death row. The United States has a vested interest in supporting both the Egyptian government as a strategic partner and the Egyptian people's universally recognized human rights. The Commission will continue to work to this end in Congress. I'll work with my colleague, Mr. Ellison, on writing the appropriate letters. And with thanks again for your patience, this hearing is adjourned.
Thank you so much. You did amazing. You made all